All right, let me share the screen. All right, and I'm just gonna make sure that your your mics are muted on the lower left-hand side. There we go. All right. Oh, there we go. All right, and welcome to Ruby Dee and Ossie Davis, A Life of Art and Activism. I want to give a shout out to their children right off at the start. They maintain a website about their parents and about their legacy, and there is a section on there that is called Love, Art, and Activism. And so this is a case of great minds think alike. Was not aware there was a section of the website that had a similar title, but I did also want to acknowledge that and give credit. So if you are not familiar with who Ruby Dee and Ossie Davis are, you probably know them best as actors. They got their start on the stage, but you've probably seen them in the movies. You've more than likely seen them on television. They were incredibly prolific for both of them pretty much right up until the end of their lives. They were writers. Ossie Davis was known a little bit more as the writer, and he was a director as well. They were also producers, they were broadcasters, they had their own radio show for a time, and they were activists. Now, I was not aware of who they were until I was in college. I had seen Do the Right Thing, I had seen the 94 version of The Stand, so I think I had heard the names. But in 2005, I was in a writing class in college, and my teacher said he wanted to pay tribute to a playwright that had died recently, and that was Ossie Davis. And he said he was a passionate man and in many ways an angry man. And he did not mean angry as a pejorative, or the way sometimes we hear the stereotypical angry black man or angry black woman. But he meant angry as in someone who saw the injustices in the world and could really not believe they were there and that they were still there. And in some ways, he couldn't believe people weren't angrier about it. So that's how I found out who Ossie Davis was. And then by extension, I found out who Ruby Dee was. And the more I learned about them, the more I was just in awe, not just of their work ethic and how much they put out there, but just how resilient they were. And I've had other programs about Black directors and just how hard it was to be a Black creator for a good amount of time in Hollywood. So for these two to maintain these careers through so many obstacles and also maintain their convictions, I thought is extremely remarkable. And on a more, I guess, fuzzy note, I actually think just their love story is amazing. Again, this is Hollywood. Marriages don't last. There's some people who've been married. I mean, what was it? Liz Taylor was 8 times. But then you see these people who were married for decades and decades and decades to the point where they became emblematic of a stable relationship in the entertainment industry. I do think it's very touching. So we're going to start with Ossie Davis when he's young, and both of these photos are from Ruby Dee and Ossie Davis's legacy website, again, the one maintained by their kids. So he was born December 18th in 1917. His name was supposed to be Rayford Chapman Davis, but the clerk at the courthouse misheard the initials RC. And as he put it in his book, he's like, well, back in the South, a lot of times we would just register ourselves by our initials. The clerks heard Ossie and wrote Ossie, and as Ossie said, he was a white clerk. My mother was a Black woman in the South. She was not going to challenge him on that. So as he puts it, he goes, my whole name was a mistake, but it's the name he had. And his father was a worker and a fairly well-known person in town, but unfortunately that did not always attract the best attention. So after a while, the family left. He left first, and then his dad moved along with him. I mean, again, Look at when he was born, look at the time he was growing up. He was living in Georgia. We're all well aware that that was not the friendliest place to be a Black person. Um, so he eventually works, is able to get to Howard University, which is one of the most famous HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities. And he does really well there. And he talks in his memoir, which is a joint memoir that he and Ruby wrote together, about just how eye-opening it was being at Harvard. So he came from a very rural area, goes to Howard. And did I say Harvard? Yes, Howard. And he's introduced to different people of different backgrounds. He's also introduced to girls in a way that he wasn't introduced to girls back in the day. Um, and he's also introduced to the idea of activism and liberation. He eventually leaves. He wants to pursue acting. He goes up to Harlem, and he's able to make his stage debut. But we see makes his stage debut in Harlem, 1941, and then what happens in December of 1941? Pearl Harbor. And he enlists in the U.S. Army, as a lot of people did, and he is stationed in Liberia. And he's written and talked about his time in Liberia and how interesting it was to be around people who were Black at a time where he was like, that he grew up around Black people, but in a place where they were the majority in the country. And also kind of having this contradiction of, we're fighting for freedom and I'm stationed in Liberia, but also I'm in an army that is segregated. So he has, again, this starts to inform his activism, and again, this kind of anger at the injustices that exist in the world. So when the war ends, he comes back and he finally gets his break on Broadway in 1945 with this play Jeb, which we will discuss in a few minutes. First, we are going to talk about Ruby. So unlike Ossie, Ruby Dee considers herself she wasn't born in Harlem, but she considers herself to be a child of Harlem. She was definitely bred in Harlem. So she was born Ruby Ann Wallace in Cleveland, Ohio, but she moves with her parents to Harlem in 1923. As a note, she did not move with her biological mother. She moved with her father and her what would be considered a stepmother, but she considers her mother. She does not go into it too much in her part of her memoir, but her biological mother was just apparently did not want to be in the picture anymore. Um, so she grew up in Harlem. Again, she grew up surrounded by Black people, but Harlem was a little different than Georgia in that Harlem had its own community. There was also a lot of art that was coming out. There was the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s. So very different upbringing from her and Ossie. So for her, art was just something she was always around. And she began acting when she was 18 years old in the American Negro Theater. And there were a lot of theater groups in Harlem at the time. They had, because this was a time where art was celebrated, but in particular for the Harlem area, it was we are making our own art. We are not making art to entertain white people. We're making art for us, by us. And in a way where they don't have the creative constraints of anyone else. She did have a brief marriage to a singer named Frankie D. Brown, which is where she got the D, and she kept it. And it works. It's a good name. It's a good stage name. It was another thing she didn't go too much into in her book. The only real clue that I had gotten was she talked about Frankie D traveling and not being around that much, and that may have just led to the dissolution of the marriage. But never got any sense that it was an extremely bad marriage. It might have just been one where it was maybe not the right time. She is fairly candid that she maybe didn't make some of the best decisions. She did graduate from Hunter College, but she talks about in her book at one point, she got so distracted between acting and marriage that she was almost failing out of some of her classes. And her parents were not too happy with that. So she's like, all right, I needed to buckle down. and, be more serious, not just about her acting career, but her academic career. And this was a quote from an NPR interview with her um, in the mid-aughts where she goes, "My dream was I was going to be an actor, and racism occurred to me. It dawned on me that I would not be an actor. It occurred to me that I was not white. It occurred to me um, that being what they called colored, being a Negro, was some kind of a disadvantage. All those things I knew as a kid, and that one of these days I was going to run away. And my first heroes were Franchot Tone and Robert Taylor, because I didn't know any black screen idols, that I see today. So the conversation of representation comes up a lot, and the importance of seeing yourself on screen. And this is a good example. She wanted to be an actress, but even when she was younger, she knew there might be only so far I can go because I don't see people that look like me. And, the two people she referenced were not black actors. So that's another reason why both she and Ossie were very, um, not only supportive of younger black actors and younger black creatives, but tried to keep making movies and keep making TV shows so other young black future performers and creatives could maybe see someone that looked like them. So Jeb, as I mentioned earlier, that's um Ossie's big debut. Ruby Dee was a little more seasoned on the stage than he was because his acting career got kind of interrupted by World War II and his enlistment. So they meet while performing Jeb, and the play is about an injured black soldier returns home to Louisiana, tries to make his way again, and kind of encounters this the discrimination and this question of, what did I fight for? And then I fought for this country, and then I come back and this is how I am received. This is how I am treated. Addressing these contradictions that a lot of black soldiers felt coming back from World War II and even fighting in World War II. So Ruby Dee, so they asked, like, what did you first think of him? She goes, "Oh, I thought he was a hick." Yeah, she's like, "Who is this skinny, lanky country boy?" And I believe her words were, "Oh, they're just letting anybody on the stage now, aren't they?" So not exactly what you'd think from, that would lead to a love that lasted decades and decades. But I mean, Ossie clearly had the talent that won her over, and as they realized they both had similar interests that drew each other to them. So Jeb had its premiere in 1946, but that was certainly not the last time Ruby and Ossie saw each other, and they actually tried to work with each other as much as they could. So they actually eventually got married in 1948. They were actually working on another play at the time, took a day off from rehearsal to go get married, and then the next day went back to rehearsal. So workaholics is a way to put it. And they remained together for over, I'm trying to do math, over 50 years. I believe 55, 56. Well, no, it'd be closer to 55 until Ossie passed away. And again, for even for regular people, that's a good long marriage, till death do you part. But for Hollywood, it's almost unheard of. Like, I still look at Tom Hanks and Rita Wilson, and I'm like, oh gosh, they're still together. Good for them. Um, they had 3 children, Hasna, Guy, and Nora, and they are the ones that maintained their legacy website. And they were considered just this, not just an example of Black love, but the standard. This is what we should want to be. Not only in a committed relationship and married, but also the idea of how they supported each other's creative endeavors. They were behind each other in terms of what they wanted to do. If Ossie wanted to direct, Ruby's like, I'm there to support my husband. Ruby wanted to write something, Ossie would help her writing. There was never a competition factor for either of them. And reading that book, they kind of say that is what truly helped keep their marriage together, is they never saw each other as competition. They saw each other as colleagues, and also as people who were they kind of saw themselves as fighting for something larger. Again, the we're here to be representation, the representation we did not have. Um, Something I did not know until I'd read that book was they had an open marriage sometime in like the 50s and 60s, which was, now stuff like polyamory and open marriages is in the conversation and a little less taboo, but back then that was not the case. And um their perspective on it, Ruby said, she goes, what we had noticed where it wasn't the sex that really destroyed the relationship, it was the secrecy. So they basically came to an understanding of, we're going to be open with each other, we're not going to do anything that could potentially get us in trouble, cause a scandal, cause any health problems, but we'll be honest. But it didn't last long. I think it was Ruby said, we figured out sex was good but love was better. And he goes, looking back, I'd say no matter what did or did not happen, we freed each other. Oh, yeah. Oh, no, he said sex is fine, but love was better. And we freed ourselves. And I just look at this and I'm like, wow, the maturity that they had regarding that whole thing is one where it's like, it's especially for that time when it was so taboo, is a kind of mind blowing, at least for me. I'm like, wow, did not know that. And I guess also kind of a good for you. You were able to figure that out and it didn't ruin anything. But regardless, they were together and they shared the screen, they shared broadcasting, but they also had careers outside of each other. So Ossie's career, he made his film debut with Way Out. No, not the Kevin Costner movie. It's film he's not credited in, but it's his. It's now listed on his IMDb. And he was someone you could call a triple threat. He could act, he could direct, he could write. And again, that seems to be something that's like, oh, there's a lot of actors who think they can write and direct. But again, keep in mind, this was a Black man in the 1950s and 60s. Harder to get stuff made and harder, to even get your foot in the door. Um, and for him, he's like, I'm not making movies for white people. I am making movies for my people. So that's kind of, and he always says that's what kept him and Ruby Dee working, is they knew who their audience at the end of the day really was. So he had a total of 113 film and TV credits and 24 stage credits. His most famous play is Pearly Victorious, which, if you follow Broadway, that had a revival very recently with Leslie Odom Jr. of Hamilton fame. I think it just closed. And Pearly was adapted multiple times. So Pearly was the musical. So Pearly Victorious is a play. Pearly is the musical. And then he adapted it into a film called Gone Are the Days, in which Ruby is in there with him. He directed Cotton Comes to Harlem, which, if you have not seen, it's actually pretty good. And it was recently played at the Coolidge Corner Theater, or I think it's going to be played. They are doing a blaxploitation slash Black filmmakers run. And Black Girl, not to be confused, there is a 1950s film called Black Girl, made by, I'm blanking on the director's name. Yeah. Um, Sorry, it was made by an African filmmaker. This is the one it was made in 1972. Um, and his final film role was the film Proud, and a lot of his work was on TV. He would pop up here and there. He was also one of the favorites of Spike Lee. He was in multiple films with him. So the still that you see down there is from the film Get on the Bus. He was also in Do the Right Thing and Jungle Fever. And Ruby's career. Now, I had said Ruby had kind of a head start on acting, but she also had a head start in terms of her film work. So her film debut was The Fight Never Ends, but she had, by the time Ossie had his uncredited appearance in No Way Out, she had a big break with the Jackie Robinson story, which was a pretty well received and widely seen movie at the time. Jackie Robinson, the first black baseball player in the major leagues, plays himself in the movie, and she plays his wife. So a big moment for her and gets her a lot of exposure. And of the film careers, she definitely had the more, I would say, the more high profile roles than Ozzy did. Um, Her other big one was she is in the film adaptation of Raisin in the Sun, which, if you have never seen, is really good. She's also in Buck and the Preacher, which is Sidney Poitier's Black Western. Ossie Davis was also in a Western. I think it was it's not the Untouchables, but no, Buccaneers. Um, but neither of them were take what we can get roles. They always tried to make sure they were taking roles that felt true to them. And if they felt a role was really beneath them and demeaning, they're like, we're not going to do it, because they also felt that we should have roles that are just as honorable and multi-layered as our white counterparts. And they were very aware of some of the discrimination when it came to who got offered what parts. And for a while, they actually wouldn't have a TV in their home for their kids to watch, because they just felt there's not good enough good representation on TV, and we can't really filter all of that through. In 2007, like almost 60 years after she starts acting, I hope I'm doing the math correctly. I usually need a pen and a paper. She receives her first Oscar nomination for American Gangster, the Ridley Scott film with Denzel Washington. And if you've seen Denzel Washington act, you can't think of too many people who can go up against Denzel Washington and kind of make him not scared, but kind of put him in his place. But she is that character in that movie. She's one of the few people who really is able to dress him down if she needs to. And she acted pretty much up until her death. Her final TV role was Betty and Coretta in 2013. She had a film role in this film, 1982, and she had her final stage role in 2003, which, for someone who started on the stage in 1940, is an incredible run. And she also helped write and produce, not as prolific as her husband, but she co-wrote the screenplay to this film Uptight, directed by Jules Dassin, and she helped adapt plays Take It From the Top and Zora Is My Name. So we mentioned they're both big stage names. This is where they worked together the most. They loved working with each other on stage, and they talk about in their book, they're like, there is something so different about acting on a stage versus acting in front of a camera. There's more spontaneity on stage. There's also higher stakes if you're on stage, because if you make a mistake, that's it. But for them, it's a bit more exciting. So these are all the plays that they did together. So starting in 1946 and then 1986. So that is a 40-year span. And this is, granted, it's from the film version, but the still is from the film adaptation of Pearly Victorious. And while they were also in Raisin in the Sun together, although Ruby was the one to make the jump to film in that case. And if you note at the bottom, Take It From the Top, that was one that she helped write. So sharing the screen, again, so you saw all of those credits with the plays. Despite being linked publicly and professionally, they really only were in 5 films together. So No Way Out, Gone Are the Days, and again, No Way Out is, some people wonder, should we really count that? Because they were, he's uncredited, she has a larger role. Countdown at Cassini, and then 2 Spike Lee films, Do the Right Thing and Jungle Fever. And I think, like most people my age, Do the Right Thing was where I first saw them, even though I didn't really realize I was looking at 2 just like titans of black entertainment and screen legends. So the characters they play in Do the Right Thing, they're not a couple on screen. And so Ruby Dee plays sister, and she is kind of the matriarch figure of this Bed-Stuy neighborhood. And Ossie Davis plays the mayor, who's not the mayor, but he's a older character. He drinks a lot, but he's definitely more on the lovable drunk end. He does try to romance her a few times. she's not exact, sister's not exactly a fan, but the few scenes they share together, you do still see just that chemistry that they both have together. Um, and they are also in Jungle Fever together. Jungle Fever is a movie I haven't gone back to because I'm not sure how well it ages. But on the other hand, Do the Right Thing, you watch that movie, and aside from some changes in technology, that's a movie where it could have been made yesterday. And they actually shared a lot more credits on television. As I said earlier, The Stand was where I think it was that or Do the Right Thing where I first saw them together. So for The Stand, Ruby had been cast as Mother Abigail. And if you haven't read The Stand, it's a big Stephen King epic novel. Um, a disease wipes out most of humanity, and there are the survivors kind of split into two groups. There's some that are the forces of good, some that are the forces of evil. Randall Flagg is the devil. Mother Abigail is kind of the voice of God, as it were. And so she had been cast. She was on set, and if you ever want to look up stills from her, they put her in old lady makeup because Mother Abigail's supposed to be 108 years old, and pretty convincing makeup for the time. Although I just look at that and I'm like, oh, Ruby Dee, why are you putting her like that? She's beautiful, but that's television. Ossie Davis gets cast as Judge Ferris by accident. So Ossie I think he was writing something at the time, but he would be on set with Ruby, especially while she was getting her makeup done, just chatting with her. And the person who they needed to play Judge Ferris got sick and couldn't do it. And since he was there, director Mick Garris is like, well, we have Ossie Davis here. He's a great actor. Hey, Ossie, do you want to tag in for this character? So that is how those two ended up sharing the screen in that mini series. I also still like that mini series. I think it holds up, the 90s-ness and all. And something I also did not know until looking into this project was they shared the airwaves. So they had a syndicated radio show, the Ossie Davis and Ruby Dee Story Hour, and I just realized I misspelled hour. That is my fault. Um, you know, I go through these things to make sure I write everything correct. I typed everything correctly, and there's still something wrong. And then this evolved into a television show, and they had their own production company through the 1980s. So again, and they used this platform to platform other Black artists, other Black writers, poets, actors. And for them, they saw this as they're giving back because they knew how hard it was to get their foot in the door and to kind of have their big break. And they didn't want it to be as hard for future Black creatives. So this was their way of making sure the next generation had it a little bit easier. Oh, one sec. There we go. So this kind of dovetails into the next topic, which is their activism. So as I said before, they were both very passionate about a lot of social issues, civil rights being the big one at the forefront of their mind. They would consistently talk about the lack of options for Black performers. And again, this was around, they were getting started. Amos and Andy had existed, and there were still minstrel shows being performed. And yes, Hattie McDaniel won an Oscar for Gone with the Wind, but she was playing a maid, and there was a conversation even back then of like, is this really the best we can be offered by Hollywood? And there were Black creatives out there. Oscar Micheaux, as I've talked about in other programs, the first documented Black filmmaker, was making films out there, but they also they did not have the distribution that a movie like Gone with the Wind had. So for them, they were not only concerned with civil rights, they were concerned specifically with opportunities for Black creatives. But the rights of Black people and all people were always at the forefront of their minds. And they were friends with many civil rights leaders. The two big ones were Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. They were one of the first celebrities to publicly support him in the late 1950s, and this was at a time where it was not really popular to do so. And they were MCs at the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. That's actually something a lot of people forget, not only about the March on Washington, but about Martin Luther King in general. While he was about civil rights and racial equality, he also had other focuses like economic equality, and he was also very anti-war towards the end of his life, which was also something they were very on board with for him, because they're like, liberation has multi-pronged approaches, not just one thing. And they were a part of the Christmas boycott of 1963. This was in response to the bombing of the church, which took four little girls. And the gist of that was, instead of buying gifts, especially from, white-owned businesses, it was uh, basically buying gifts for kids, but it was also sending money to support civil rights causes. And um also there was this idea of like, keep the money in the community in this case. Like, that bombing was, and still is in many, depending where you go, a raw wound for them. And they were also joined by author James Baldwin and musician Odetta. So they were pretty very vocal civil rights proponents. And they were also friendly with Malcolm X, which Malcolm X and Martin Luther King were not as diametrically opposed to each other as sometimes portrayed. They had some differences in their ideology, but they also would would talk with each other and, you know, bounce ideas back and forth, to put it politely. But Ossie Davis delivered the eulogy at Malcolm X's funeral. And if you've ever seen the Spike Lee biopic of Malcolm X, which also stars Denzel Washington, they use the audio of Ossie Davis's eulogy. And so you can read it online if you'd like to, or you can go look up clips. And their protests for civil rights did not end in the 1960s. They were out there pretty much, again, up until the end of their lives. So in 1999, when the police killed Amadou Diallo, they not only protested, they were arrested at the protest. And keep in mind, they were both in their 70s at this point. So you could even argue, people talk about, Hollywood protesting, and the idea of like, well, what are you really doing? You have private jets, and you have money. These were two creatives who were willing to, not only put themselves out there when it was politically unpopular to do so, but they were willing to put their bodies on the line. And as I mentioned earlier, they weren't just for civil rights, they had other causes as well, which leads us to McCarthyism, which, hey, it came back again. Because if you were here for my July program on the Red Scare, I talked about how a number of different actors had to kind of navigate that. And one of the ones I talked about was Lena Horne, and Jackie Robinson, two people who, if their careers were ruined, they did not have many places to go. Lena Horne's career was almost torpedoed until she went and pretty much disavowed everything and was able to get her career back on track. Meanwhile, Jackie Robinson went and spoke out against Paul Robeson, who was an activist who the Ruby Dee and Ossie were very friendly with. So, but again, for them, there was kind of a self-preservation factor to it. So they were targeted both because, again, they were associated with Paul Robeson and some of their actions. And also keep in mind, support for civil rights was pinged very early as a potential, like, oh, you might be a communist. So for Ruby Dee, what specifically got her on the red channels was she spoke at a rally that was in favor of clemency for Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. So this is from Ruby Dee, one of Ruby Dee's chapter of their book, where she said, everyone knew about Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, who were accused of being spies who had given the secret of the atom bomb to the Soviet Union. When the case first appeared in the news in 1950, I felt no special interest, accustomed as I was to stories of witch hunts, blacklisting, persecution, and discrimination. To those people newly exposed to the victimization system, I thought, welcome to the club. This is what Blacks have suffered and continue to suffer in varying degrees all the time. She continues, some of the details of the case, however, began to stir in my conscience. A mother and a father were about to be killed. Spies were executed in a time of war. We were not at war. I was baffled. What was going on behind the headlines here? I had been warned speaking out could cost me jobs and adversely affect my career. Ugly things were beginning to happen to free-thinking people in the business, especially in Hollywood. Well-known writers and actors were refused work and lost access to livelihood. So for her, what moved her to speak at the favor of clemency was her opposition to the death penalty. As she said it, as she put it, she goes, I do know that I was tremendously moved by the fact that two small children might be left without their parents. And that was why she chose to speak in favor of clemency. Again, not saying she believed they were innocent or condoning their actions, but simply she felt execution was wrong. And that got her on the red channels, which, if you remember from my program, that was one of the publications that just listed a lot of people who were suspected communists. But again, keep in mind, there were a lot of things that could make you a suspected communist back then. And association does not automatically equal affiliation. And again, Ossie Davis both being friends with Robeson, that was something that also kind of pulled them in to potentially being blacklisted. And thankfully, they didn't have too much trouble because they worked in theater mostly, and they both say in their book, they're like, the theater world was nowhere near as restrictive as Hollywood was. But it still took a toll on them. As I mentioned before, Jackie Robinson testified and specifically kind of disavowed Paul Robeson. And Ossie Davis said, he goes, we were very hurt by that. They kind of saw it as like throwing him under the bus. And keep in mind, Jackie Robinson had co-starred with Ruby Dee in a film. So she actually she did not comment on what she thought about Jackie Robinson, and that maybe she just felt it was best not written. But they stayed in the theater world, which really kind of kept them shielded too much from the Red Scare stuff that we saw in, the big McCarthy hearings. Ossie decided to channel his frustrations into a play called Alice in Wonder. Meanwhile, Ruby Dee worked with two blacklisted writers for the play The World of Solomon Ackman, and they specifically wanted her because they had seen her at the clemency rally and thought that she had the right spirit for this play. And so this is from Ossie. He said, Ruby and I were able to work and not starve to death because we were able to create a relationship with our own people that constituted an audience that would support our product, whether Hollywood bought it or not. One of the most important things the Black artist has to learn early on is how to belong to Black people. And this is something they'd kind of reiterated. They're like, at the end of the day, we're making work for us, not for everybody else. And again, that is a survival mechanism as well. And if you remember from the program, the theater world was something where a lot of people kind of went back to. They're like, okay, Hollywood clearly isn't going to work, but the theater world isn't as restrictive. So moving on to that, Ossie passed away in 2005 on February 4th. And about a day or two later was when my professor talked about him and how affected he was by some of his plays and some of the performances he had seen. And that had encouraged me to say, maybe I should look this guy up. And he was filming a movie. I believe the movie was called Retirement. So and he was in Florida. And his funeral was a big deal because you can see that both Spike Lee and Harry Belafonte, another civil rights legend, were in attendance. And Ruby worked she lived and worked almost a full 10 years after that. And if anything, she had a bit of a career resurgence afterward, mainly because of her work in American Gangster. She actually got a SAG award for it and While she received the Academy Award nomination, she did not win. I think she was, at the time, the oldest woman to receive an Academy Award nomination at the age of 83. I think that record was eventually broken. I'm blanking on the actress's name, but she was in Amour about 5 years later. Um, I do remember watching that broadcast. Considering Dee had won the SAG award, everyone figured she was a shoo-in for the Oscar, and when Tilda Swinton won, people were very surprised. Although I like Tilda Swinton as well. I'm not that angry about that. And Ruby Dee eventually passes away in 2014. She's 91 years old, and she's surrounded by her family. And I loved this uh what she said here. I think you mustn't tell your body, you mustn't tell your soul, I'm going to retire. You may be changing your life emphasis, but there's still things that you have in mind to do that now seems the right time to do. I don't really believe in retiring as long as you can breathe. And if you look at the work of both Ossie Davis and Ruby Dee, they both really exemplify that. And as I said earlier, their children are still alive and they maintain the website, OssieandRuby.com. And I also wanted to have this one last bit for what this was from their memoir together. This is from Ruby. The largest piece of unfinished business before humankind is, in our opinion, poverty, spiritual as well as material, racism, yes, and sexism too. Unemployment, drugs, child abuse, Black boys too much in prison. The struggle is all there and we are still committed. Even if from time to time it finds us slow or absent, we ask the struggle to accept our children, to give them meaning and purpose just as it did us, to make a place for them in the line of march. And again, their legacy is alive and well. And thankfully, they got awards when they were alive. This was not one where everyone realized, oh no, we did not honor these people when they were still here. So in 2004, they got the Kennedy Center honors next to Elton John. I think it's Elton John, Warren Beatty, John Williams, and I am blanking on the person next to them, but they're in very good company. National Medal of the Arts, Lifetime, and they've gotten award from the Civil Rights Museum. Ruby Dee has an Obie. She has a Drama Desk Award. She has her Emmys. She has a SAG Award. Ossie has a Tony. He had a Peabody, multiple Image Award, and there are young actors coming up who still cite them as like, oh, they're inspirations to me. And again, I think that's a great legacy. If someone is inspired by you, and as I mentioned earlier, Ossie's play, Pearly Victorious, was revived on Broadway, starring Leslie Odom Jr. I think it just finished its run, but their art is still alive and their legacy is still alive. And with that, I'm going to see if anyone has any questions. All right, any questions? You can either put them in the chat or you can ask, or comments. I mean, I can always ask, do you remember seeing any of the people, either of them in any movies? Oh, I think, Jane, you're on mute.
Oh, I just said I had never heard of them
Oh,
until
really?
this program.
Wow.
Yeah,
Yeah, they're
I've lived in a hole.
mhm. Manchester has their joint autobiography if you would like to read it, but I always tell people, like, if you want a good starter place, like, I think in terms of what's in print, Do the Right Thing is probably the quickest thing that you can get, but some of their older stuff you can find, it's on YouTube, it's on archive.org. But I would absolutely say look their stuff up. And they're also, again, they're both really good with the written word. And again, reading their joint memoir together was one where it's just like, I'd love to be in a room with them and just chatting. And they're cute too. Like, they talk about, like, Ruby's like, oh, our relationship isn't perfect. We fight. I still win all the time. So yeah, I've been kind of wanting to tackle them for a while. So I was very glad that I could do this program. All right, well, if there are no other questions, a little shorter one for me. Although it kind of makes sense considering the last presentation we had, Best of 2023, was very long and had a lot of discussion, mainly about Barbie. Oh, so question from Diane. Why do you think they aren't as known as they should be with the legacy like that? They are fairly, I think it depends on what circle you are in. I know that in like, especially in Black film circles, they are extremely highly exalted. Um, I almost wanted to call them like the king and queen of Black cinema, but I'm like, no one else has called them that, and I don't think I should be able to. I don't think I have the right to call them that. Very highly exalted. In the playwright world, like the theater world, they're also held in really high regard. Also, I mean, the horror circle, Ruby and Ossie always get a pass for being in the stand. They're like, heck yeah, these two like really well-renowned theater actors went and were in a horror miniseries. That's cool. But the horror community is like that. Anybody, you could be in one horror movie in your entire career, and we'll just be like, you're with us. We like you. Um, but yeah, I would say, I mean, I mean, they were big enough to get like Kennedy Center honors, but they, again, they're not like Denzel Washington well known on a I guess a general film nerd level, but if you go to certain areas of pop culture, they're really really well known there. So it's kind of like last year when I did the my program on Setsuko Hara. If you were to ask anyone on the street who she is, they'd probably like, I don't know who that is. But if you were to ask like a cinemaphile, they would be like, "Oh, I know who she is. She's in Yasujiro Ozu's movies. She was in Tokyo Story." So sometimes it just depends on who you ask. But that's why I also like to do these programs to introduce them to new people and hopefully, get the word out a little more. Oh, were they in musicals at all? There was Pearly, which was a musical. I don't know if either of them performed in it though. I don't think either of them sang. Um, but a lot of Aussie stuff it was more he was more like play, not musical play. But when he passed away, I was able to find Playbill, which is like the big Broadway magazine. They had a really long obituary for him and talked about like how much ground he and his wife broke for Black performers on stage. Because again, even being on Broadway at the time for a Black actor was like, oh wow, it was a big deal. So, all right, any other questions? Alrighty, well, with that, I will see you next month with the hidden depths of Hollywood starlets. I'm going to talk about people like Hedy Lamarr. I am going to talk about a couple of blonde bombshells that everyone wrote off as bimbos, but were actually a lot smarter than people gave them credit for. And I am going to talk about Lucille Ball and how she is the opposite of a ditz in real life. She was a woman where the cameras went off, her goofy face went away, and she was like grabbing the script, like, okay, we're going to go over this scene again. She was a woman who was very, very, very in control of her brand. So very excited for that next month. And oh boy, I'm already excited for April. I love talking about physical media. All right. Oh, perfect program for this month. That's also why I wanted to do it. I always try to focus on Black creators and Black cinema for Black History Month. I feel it's the least I can do. And same with Women's History Month. I always like to try to highlight women in film. And I should do something for Asian American month as well. But that's a future program. All righty. Well, everyone, have a great night.
Okay, thank you very much.